The Swedish insanity regarding prostitution just made another victim, the People's Republic of France. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so the far left did it again, this time in France. And it's no surprise that the far left is the driving force. As I explained back in September last year, it's always the left, almost without exception, that tries and has always been trying to make prostitution illegal. The right-wing traditionalists view prostitution as immoral and would take community measures to shun the phenomenon, but it's the big state secular leftists who want to make it illegal. And France is no exception. Coming from the Telegraph, France outlaws paying for sex. And goes like this, quote, France has outlawed buying sex after more than 2 years of heated debate, passing a law on Wednesday that slaps a €1,500 fine on those who pay for prostitutes while decriminalizing the sex workers themselves. Repeat offenders stand to pay €3,750 and face being sent on compulsory classes to learn of the perils of prostitution. The new legislation, inspired by a similar 1999 law in Sweden, told ya, means France now has one of the toughest laws against sex buyers in Europe, along with Norway and Iceland. Just a short reminder, Iceland is also the country that stands right next to Saudi Arabia and Iran on banning striptease clubs and lap dancing, but for feminist reasons. No wonder feminists love Islamists. Anyway, back to the article. This is an historic step in the conquest of women's rights, says Grégoire Théry, head of Le Mouvement d'Uni, which wants to abolish prostitution. It's a revolution in the country of Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the Moulin Rouge, and the Little Women of Pigalle, the red light district, he added. Which is precisely why it won't work, you moron. Anyway, French politicians had for months been at loggerheads over the law. The left-wing majority in the lower house approved the legislation, only to see it twice rejected by the majority right-wing Senate. But the National Assembly on Wednesday had the final word. Again, nothing surprising. It's always the left trying to pull this kind of shit. Anyway, prostitution is currently legal in France, but in 2003, the conservative government passed a law banning passive soliciting by prostitutes on the street. The new legislation scraps that measure, which is rarely enforced, judging by the droves of prostitutes who stroll around Parisian districts like Belleville seeking custom in broad daylight. Brothels, pimping, and the sale of sex by minors remain illegal. The new law also makes it easier for foreign prostitutes to acquire a 6-month temporary residence permit if they enter a process to get out of the prostitution business. Translation: you're a woman seeking to move to France? Take the plane and go to the nearest police station and claim you're a hooker. You don't have to be one, just have the vajayjay and learn a few feminazi keywords in French. That will be more than enough to convince the cultural Marxist in there. But wait, it gets even funnier. Quote, fines will be channeled into a special fund to help prostitutes leave the game, which will receive €4.8 million from the French state each year. The debate over whether to penalize the customers of prostitutes became a cause célèbre for some French stars, with Catherine Deneuve and Charles Aznavour among 60 Gallic celebrities who signed a petition to protest against it, arguing it will only serve to drive the sex trade further underground. More controversially, a group of writers, actors, and public figures who have been, go to, or will go to prostitutes released a manifesto of 343 bastards entitled Hands Off My Whore. We believe that everyone has the right to freely sell their charms and even to like doing so, and we refuse that MPs decree norms on our desires and our pleasures, it declared. Many sex workers are against the law, and some demonstrated in front of the parliament on Wednesday. We can already see the consequences of the law, said Morgane Morteuil of the sex workers union Stras. those who are able to leave to work in neighboring countries. The others are looking for agencies, salons, intermediaries who will play the role of pimps to put them in touch with clients, she said. But Maud Olivier, a socialist MP who drew up the text, said it will help fight trafficking networks and, quote, "I'm proud that our country is passing this law, which means prostitutes are now seen as victims, not delinquents," she told Agence France-Presse. It was, she added, vital to, quote, "no longer consider it normal to buy someone's body." We will end up changing mentalities, but it will take time and some explaining, with training for police, gendarmes, and magistrates, she said. However, some experts said that those who buy sex over the internet are unlikely to be caught by the new law. Dating websites are one of the main ways to connect prostitutes with clients, said sociologist Laurent Melito. Then people call each other. How are you going to control that? Well, I'll tell you how they'll control that. They'll renounce any pretense of respecting privacy and will start listening to everyone's phone calls. You know, just in case you call a hooker. Or ask a tenant about his income and broke an equally idiotic law that France recently adopted from the third socialist world. Or a plethora of many other batshit crazy laws that France is riddled with. Now, let's be brutally honest here. Prostitution is the second oldest job on earth. Not the first. The oldest job on earth is hunter, because someone had to first acquire some wealth in order to buy sex. Anyway, the oldest or the second oldest, prostitution has always been with humanity and will continue to be forever and ever till the end of time. Damn, that sounded a bit preachy, but it is nonetheless true. Wherever you stand on this issue from a moral standpoint is completely irrelevant in a policy discussion. The question is, should two adults who decide to exchange wealth in return for sexual services be kidnapped, beaten, have their property seized, or killed themselves by the state for doing so? That's really the question. Because at the end of the day, the law is just a political opinion enforced by the barrel of a gun. That's what the law is. It's not a moral statement, it's not holy, and most definitely it is not fundamentally good. In fact, the overwhelming majority of laws of any country in Europe in present day are fundamentally evil. There, I said it. Now, this policy approach to prostitution is particularly evil, once you know its ideological underpinnings. This approach was born out of activist misandry carefully fermented in organizations such as Riksorganisationen för kvinnor och tjejer i Sverige, or ROKS, which is an organization that quite literally kidnaps women with the purpose of convincing them that they were in fact saved and then brainwashed into radical feminism. And no, I'm not joking. I'll leave in the low bar a link to a 2-hour documentary made about them by a feminist, no less, and broadcasted by the Swedish state television. Well, it was broadcasted once, because afterwards it was censored since the board of directors contained several ROKS members. Now, mind you, ROKS is not the only organization that pushed this in Sweden and then internationally. It was also the academe, particularly the Uppsala University, which is Sweden's factory of extremist ideology since forever. Professor Christian Diesen and Eva Diesen from the Stockholm University, both involved in drafting criminal law, have together published books in which they don't shy away from promoting outright misandry. In one of their books, for instance, their policy advice for laws regarding sexual conduct is, quote, "The average Swedish man should ideally spend a year of his life in jail due to poor sexual interaction with women." That is the ideological underpinning of this law. Now, with all the talk about trying to help victims of trafficking and all the rest of that claptrap, well, that's all bullshit. And the leftists know it, or at least the ideologues who write this kind of crap. The rest of them are just drones towing the parting line like any good conformist, non-conformist, totalitarian fucktards that they are. If you want to help victims of sex trafficking, you might want to avoid driving the whole bloody industry into the underground. If you want to help prostitutes get out from the game, as this article calls it, you first and foremost have to accept that most prostitutes are not victims. Quite the opposite is true. The vast majority of hookers are not victims, never were, and never will be. But for those who indeed are victims, the industry being severely underground is a huge impediment towards them getting help. And using this type of chicanery will have exactly that effect, whether its supporters admit it or not. You know, many years ago, I conducted the field research for a policy paper that eventually did end up changing the law in this country by making prostitution merely a civil offense that no one bothers to rigidly enforce, whereas in the past it was quite a serious felony. While it was a felony, it not only prevented actual victims from seeking help, but it also made the victim's situation far worse because it opened the prospects for corruption within the police, with police officers extorting bribes from hookers in exchange for not arresting them and putting them in jail. And mind you, this happens to various extents everywhere where prostitution is illegal in the classical sense. And it's not really a shock. When you provide the incentives, you'd be a fool to deny that there will be enough individuals to pick up on those incentives. Anyway, so as I was saying, I conducted this field research which involved doing a ton of interviews with actual hookers working illegally. I don't remember the exact number, but I spoke with several hundreds of hookers. More than 300, that's for sure. Now, the framework of the study pretty much allowed the researcher to take any case and bring it to light if an instance of victimization was suspected. The police were aware of the study and had promised to avoid charging the victims coming forward. At that time, I really believed that at least 10% of hookers are victims of either trafficking or extortion, and that at least 5% of them had been victims of 3 or more crimes. Boy, I was so wrong. The worst case I encountered was a 39-year-old who had some regrets joining the business, but was looking forward to reach her goal of raising 60,000 euros so she could finally get her own place and start a business and then live off some passive income that she also had until the business becomes sustainable. That was the worst case in over 300 cases closely documented. And mind you, when I did those interviews, the conditions of hookers here were allegedly the worst in Europe. The international press at the time was talking about tens of thousands of victims, yet when questioned about it, the examples were sparse. The more spectacular the claims about prostitutes' victimization, the less likely were they to have an actual example. Now mind you, that doesn't mean that there are no prostitutes who have been victimized. Of course there are. I even met 2 such cases in a completely separate context from this study, so I'm not saying that victimization doesn't exist in the sex work industry. But what I am saying is that based on the actual evidence I personally gathered for a study that eventually did change a law, most prostitutes simply are not victims, and never have been. And treating them as they are is, quite frankly, inhumane. It takes away their agency as responsible adults and turns them into children. Saying that victimization is high amongst prostitutes in Europe is saying that millions of people across this continent, both women and men, are simply too stupid to know what's best for them and that they should surrender their entire agency as adults to their ideological superiors on the man-hating feminist left. I'm sorry, but that's just nuts. I can barely know enough to help my close friends to pursue their interests, and that's when I know them very well and they beg me to help them, and I'm still unsure oftentimes on whether I'm providing the best advice or not. Yet these people, the socialists in France, the misandrist feminists in Sweden, the misandrist feminists in Iceland, and so on and so forth, these people genuinely believe that they, and they alone, know better than millions of people across cultures and countries what these millions of people should do with their lives. How much of an egomaniac you'd have to be to even think of you in such terms? Now look, at the end of the day, France is not Sweden on this aspect. For better or worse, being sexually libertine is a historical tradition in France. And the anti-prostitution activist quoted by the Telegraph knows it when he says, quote, "This law is a revolution in the country of Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the Moulin Rouge, and the Little Women of Pigalle." It's only that this activist has things backwards. The French populace still very much likes Dominique Strauss-Kahn and would stand a serious chance of being elected President of the Republic if he'd run again, despite his indiscretions. The French public doesn't regard sexual indiscretions, including going to hookers, the same way Americans do. The French public as a whole doesn't view sexual politics the same way as the Swedes do. The French public has its own peculiar problems, but being puritanical left-wing bigots to want to bring state violence into mutually beneficial sexual transactions? Nope, that's not the nation of France, or what's left of it. What I'm saying here is that the law will be broken on a wide scale and enforcement will be next to non-existent. The leftists have it backwards. You can't change culture through legislation. At best, you can curtail some manifestations of it, but only for a very short while. And in the age of technology, good luck monitoring the pimping that goes on in the online environment. Ultimately, the only ones who will lose in this whole equation will be the prostitutes themselves, who will have to relocate to get new work, learn new technologies to get clients, and possibly raise some of their tariffs due to the increased risk. In some jurisdictions where this stupidity is in place, some hookers even learn to convincingly lie that their client is their boyfriend. That's what these kinds of laws end up doing. They encourage more law-breaking, more lying, less honesty, and even more underground practices. Congratulations, you fucking morons!